So I'm an instructor and what would you say, course developer, documentalist, documentation person for 4Js. This course is a brand new course just for you guys, in fact. So if you see any errors or any typos, let me know and I'll get them fixed. We have 4 modules over the next 2 days. We were going to do all 4 of them in one day, but that does sound like an awful lot in one day. So we're going to break it up over 2 days. So today we'll just do this little course introduction that we're working on now, an introduction to the debugger, and module 2, getting started. The getting started module will talk about most of the, let's say, the features, the commands, and views for the debugger, and we'll have a lab where you'll actually learn most of the debugger functionality by doing what you might call a trace of a program, tracing the logic through a program. And it'll be that accounts application that we were looking at a few minutes ago in that office source sample. And then tomorrow we'll start with module 3, where we talk about a few more views and commands in the debugger that you can use to actually get in and do a better job of analyzing or locating errors with the debugger. And then module 4 is, I would call them kind of odds and ends, miscellaneous tools and considerations. Some of that falls outside really the scope of the debugger, but they're things that Laurent, especially our support person here in the U.S., wanted to make sure you had. So some of the stuff in module 4 is not actually debugger, but that it is debugging related. So a few pages here, or a few slides here on the interface, the Go to Training interface that we're using for the class. If you need to leave for lunch, for example, and come back, it's not going to be a problem. It won't bother anybody. We're recording the session, so if you miss part of it, you can always come back in and listen to it later. You'll have a little follow-up email when we finish the session. It'll probably come sometime later this afternoon. And when you get that follow-up email, it'll have a link in there for the recording. So that recording will be posted, I imagine, probably at least 6 months. So you'll have plenty of time to come back and listen to it if you want to. There is a chat interface. We've been using it a little bit this morning. So if you need to send me a question and for some reason I don't hear you, if you actually give me the question verbally, you can send it to me in the chat interface. Or maybe you're just shy. You can send it that way. So here's your interface, the Go to Training interface. I've got a better picture, I think, on the next page. But right here in the middle is the viewing area where you'll see the slides, or should be seeing the slides. And then over on the right-hand side, I've got the control panel, or a screenshot of your control panel. So let me get the better slide of that. It's a bigger slide. So here's a blown-up picture of the control panel. This arrow up at the top, the red arrow or the white arrow with the red background, you can use that to minimize the control panel so it doesn't take up so much of your screen real estate. There's the mute button, so if you need to listen to the radio or answer the phone or something like that, you can always mute yourself with the mute button. There's a telephone option, so if you're having problems with voice over IP, you can switch to telephone. I think if you click that, toggle that to the telephone option, you should see a phone number right there that you can use to dial in. And then down here at the bottom, it's hard to see, but that's a raise hand icon. So if you do have a question for me, I'll try to keep an eye on that out of the corner of my eye. But if I don't see it, feel free just to interrupt me. That won't bother me at all. And down here at the bottom is the chat interface. All right, so far so good. Everybody okay with the control panel and can hear me okay? No issues with sound, all that good stuff? Okay. All right, well, let's take a look at the course objectives. This is for the whole 2 days, this course objectives. Today, we'll get into the purpose and features, or most of the features of the debugger. Most of the features involve things like being able to step through the source code or review the source code as it executes. You can step through the lines one line at a time or lots of lines at a time, depending on what you want to do. We'll talk about something called breakpoints and watch points. Those are two of the big features of the debugger. Breakpoints stop program execution arbitrarily, right? You just specify an area in the source code where you want the application to stop executing, and that gives you a chance to go out and, let's say, look at the source code around that breakpoint more carefully. You can look at the values of program variables while it's stopped at that breakpoint. You can even change variable values if you want to at these breakpoints, and then go ahead and start program execution again with these changes if you want to. And we'll talk more about that. Getting into that's a little bit more advanced debugger functionality. We'll get into that tomorrow. There's also something called a watch point. A watch point is a way to stop program execution not at an arbitrary line of source code like a breakpoint does, but a watch point will actually stop program execution based on a program variable. So when a program variable that you're watching with a watch point changes, that will automatically stop program execution. So that's typically when you're debugging and you're trying to figure out exactly when some sort of event happens by monitoring a specific program variable. And when that variable changes, it'll stop at the line following that change. You can monitor variables while the application's running. It's particularly handy to do that at a breakpoint, but you can also do that, let's say, when you encounter an interactive dialog statement like menu or input or display array or construct. You can also see the values of variables when you're interacting with the application like that. View or trace function calls. We'll see most of that tomorrow. That's really in tomorrow's agenda. But we'll talk a little bit about some of the views in the debugger today. And one of the views and some of the commands that you can use actually allow you to try to figure out exactly how you got to the point where you are in an application by tracing the function calls that led up to that point. So there's a backtrace view, they call it, that you can use to trace your function calls. And there's also an up and down command that we'll look at that you can use to track your function calls. That's pretty handy when you're trying to trace logic in a program or debugging. In the last chapter, the Module 4 that I said was a lot of miscellaneous topics, it's not all related to the actual debugger. We talk about Code Analyzer that has some diagrams that you can use to also do things like trace function calls and see exactly the sequence of function calls, what calls what, where it returns and what it returns, and that type of thing. So that will be in Module 4 tomorrow. And again, it's not exactly part of the debugger, but it does make a nice debugging tool. Okay, so here's our 4 modules. We're getting ready to start Module 1. We'll just see how it goes today. We're scheduled to go 3 hours, I believe, but I don't think the lecture will take 3 hours. I suspect that probably the lecture will take maybe an hour and a half is probably my best guess. And then after that, hopefully that will still leave you plenty of time to do the debug lab, Lab 1. Do you guys have the entire block, the 3 hours set aside for the course?
Yeah, we do here. Yeah.
Great. Okay. Well, hopefully you'll have time. Anybody planning on doing the debug lab this afternoon?
We probably will.
Okay. I think you'll enjoy it. I spent quite a bit of time on both of those labs, hopefully to show you not every single feature that we'll go over, but I think the biggies are there. So if you do the lab, I think it won't take longer than 45 minutes or an hour, and I think it'll give you a pretty good session, a hands-on session with all the features that we talk about. All right, here's our topics for this first module. We'll just have an overview of the debugger, the basic purpose and features. We won't talk about all the details here. It's just an overview, but we will in the next 3 chapters. A little bit about local and remote debugging, some debugger best practices, and where to find documentation and online help if you get stuck with the debugger. So the general purpose of the debugger is to test and control application behavior while the application is actually executing. So you can actually stop and start program execution inside the debugger, which gives you a chance to analyze the source code that was running when you stopped the application, check the values of program variables while you're suspended, even change program variables if you want to, and then go ahead and resume program execution with those changes to see how that affects behavior. We have these breakpoints that we mentioned a page or so ago that you can use to interrupt a program arbitrarily at a specific breakpoint. That would be a specific line of code, line of source code. And then you can, again, kind of monitor the source or examine the source, the variables that are in play when you interrupt the program. And then when you're ready, you can go ahead and resume execution. Monitor or change values of program variables. Resume with the new values. Talked about the backtrace view that you can use to trace functions called while you're running the program. And there's also a couple of commands that you can use that we'll look at, the up and down commands that you can also use to trace function calls. So it's a good way to debug applications, but it's also useful for familiarizing yourself with code someone else has written. So that first lab we do this afternoon will actually be using the debugger to get familiar with the features and commands and views, but also to see how you can use it to get familiar with someone else's code. And in this case, the code will be that Office Store sample application. So the debugger has multiple interfaces. Traditionally, people have used it from the command line, so it does still have a command line interface. Down here at the bottom of the slide, let me see if I can find my pointer here. I've lost my control panel. Let me drag it back over here so I can point stuff out. I'll try the highlighter here. So traditionally, people have used the command line with the debugger down here at the bottom of the slide. To use the debugger from the command line, you need to start the application with the -D switch, FGL run space -D in the application, and that will put you in debug mode. And this is the debug prompt, FGL DB. And in the commands, you can see you have these one-line commands. You have the basic command like step in this example, and then usually it has some sort of parameter, in this case step 5, so it's stepping forward 5 lines. You can also use the command line inside of Studio. A little later we'll see that there's a command view. Actually, I've got a screenshot right here on the right. So right up here at the top is a command prompt. So you can actually use commands manually from inside this command view if you want to. And I do have a few of those in the lab just to get you familiar with that whole idea. But all the commands, or most of the commands, are also integrated with the toolbar, the debug menu options. At least the most common commands are there. If you start getting outside more of the common commands, you can go to the command prompt inside the command view for those if you want to. So the debugger is integrated with Studio tools, meaning that you can launch the debugger from inside Project Manager. When you're in the middle of a debug session, the source code is displayed in Code Editor, another Studio view. The code structure view is used with the debugger. The output view that you're familiar with shows debugger output. So all the debugger functionality has been integrated with the rest of the Studio tools. All right, here it's talking a little bit about local debugging and remote debugging. So you can debug in a local environment. If you're using Studio and using the debugger with Studio, usually the default configuration works just fine. If you're able to run the application or execute the application in Project Manager, then all the environment variables that you need are probably set okay to go ahead and use the debugger. If you're using it from the command line, there's a couple of environment variables you'll want to check. Grab my pen again here. The FGL source environment variable from the command line, you want to make sure you have that set correctly so that the debugger can find the source files. And I've got a Unix example here and a Windows example. If you don't have that FGL source path environment variable set, it'll still find the source code if it's in the current directory where you launched Studio, or it will also look in the, FGL LD path as well. So either one of those situations, it will still find the source code as well. But I guess the proper way to do it is to make sure you have this FGL source path environment variable set to point to the source code. All right, remote debugging. You can use remote debugging, for example, with production environments. Here's some prerequisites for remote debugging. You might have seen this screenshot or this drawing if you've looked at the Studio documentation. This comes straight out of the Studio doc. It's talking about a remote Studio configuration. So if you have a remote Studio configuration, for example in a production environment, you'll need the Genero Studio server installed on your production server, and you'll need the Studio client on your local machine. And then they're talking about the prerequisites here. The binaries need to be on the remote server, the source files need to be on the remote server, and that FGL source path environment variable that we talked about on the previous page. Of course, those environment variables need to be set correctly to specify the source files on that remote server. And just a few more pages. Best practices and limitations. A lot of these come straight from Laurent, our U.S. support person. He wanted to make sure I included these. He's suggesting that you use, for remote sessions, that you use SSH because he thinks or finds that SSH is faster than using VPN for a remote session. And he suggests that for remote debug sessions you set up a direct connect shortcut for the Genero desktop client configured with SSH. And if you're using Studio, right, sensitive mouse there. If you're using Studio, you can do the same thing. Configure your remote Studio configuration to use SSH, and then you can debug from within Studio that way. So the first bullet here is for command line debugging with a direct connect shortcut, and then the second bullet is remote debugging with a remote Studio configuration. And then the second topic here is talking about the debugger. Can't be used to debug Java, C modules. It's strictly limited to BDL. So you have to use a different debugging tool to debug errors, for example, in JavaScript or CSS. You always have to have the source code. So even on a production site, it does need to be able to access the source code.
Can the source code be on one machine and the database and executors on another machine, on the remote machine?
You know, we had a big discussion about that actually when I was working on the course. I was talking to the product manager about that. And yes, there are scenarios where that should work, you know, in your FGL source path environment variable, you know, should just be set to point to the correct source code. But apparently some of that configuration is a little problematical right now. So I tell you what I'll do is I'll make a note of that, and Laurent is going to pop in on a session tomorrow about 1 o'clock, and I'll kind of give him a heads up that you're curious about that, and he can give you the latest and greatest about it. Does that work okay?
Yeah, that leads me to my next question. If that's possible, then does Genero Studio still need to be installed on the production machine?
Well, if you Well, actually, if you want, I'm just going to take a shot at it here, but again, we can clarify with Laurent just in case I'm not right. It depends, I guess, on how you're going to do the debugging. If you're doing the debugging from the command line, then no, it wouldn't need to be there. But if you're doing a remote debugging session in Studio, then you would still need your client server configuration, right? The Studio server would still need to be there. That server piece is what actually executes the debug commands.
I guess what I'm asking is if I'm running Genero Studio on my development machine, I wanted to connect to the production machine to debug it.
Right.
Because maybe that database has the data that's causing the error, the anomalies.
Right.
So basically I'm running it on develop, but I want to use the data and possibly the executable on production.
My understanding is that if you're using Studio to do the debugging from, let's say, your development machine, then that Studio that you have on your development machine would be the client piece, right, the Studio client. And it's still going to need to communicate with a Studio server on the production machine. And that Studio server is actually the component that is going to execute those debug commands. Even though they're coming from the development machine, the server executes them.
So, yeah,
Does that make sense?
Yeah, so Genero Studio needs to be basically on both development and production.
Yeah, the server piece, right? There's a server piece that would need to be on the production machine, and then the client piece would be on the client, the development machine in your question.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, and you feel free also to run that by Laurent. You know, he's by far more the expert than I am, but that's just the way that I understand it works. So, all right. All right, I believe this might be the last slide in this little quick overview, the online help and documentation. So if you're looking for online help for the debugger, maybe wanting to look up a command, for example, to see if there is such a command to do something you want to do, there's a help button in the toolbar. The F1 key, of course, gets you an online help. There's some documentation for the Studio, the graphical debugger interface, under Genero Studio documentation. So go to Help, then Genero Studio, and then the graphical debugger. And that has, you know, your Studio screenshots, your Studio menu options, and that type of thing. If you're interested in just, let's say, a list of commands that you could use with the debugger, say from the command prompt inside Studio or from the command line outside Studio, you can find those under the BDL documentation. So Help, Genero BDL, Programming, and then there's a debugger topic under Programming. And it has a lot of debugger information there as well, but it's command line type documentation. It's focused on the command line. But it does have a kind of an exhaustive list of debugger commands that you may be interested in, even if you're primarily using Studio for your debugging sessions. So two different places you can find documentation. If you're looking for, let's say, commands, go to the BDL, the programming documentation with an exhaustive list of commands. If you're looking for how to do something in Studio with the debugger, look under the Studio documentation. And I'll demo those to you as well when we finish our session today. Won't take but just a minute. All right, so that was just the first little overview chapter. Any questions or comments besides the remote configuration? Let me make a note on that too, so I'll know to kind of run that by Laurent. Let me make a note real quick. Remote debugger. I'm fairly sure that I'm correct on it, but I'll defer, of course, to him. All right. All right, well, let's go ahead and take a look at Module 2. That's where we really get into debugger features, commands, and views. So we have two topics. We have a debugger basic topic where we talk about the purpose and features of the debugger, see some screenshots of the various views, for example. And then topic 2 is more or less an example of tracing logic with the debugger. And of course that's a lead-in for your lab this afternoon. So probably the first place to start anytime you're talking about the debugger is with a breakpoint. I guess that's one of the primary features. You actually start a debug session typically with a breakpoint, even before you launch the debugger. Let's say I go in and just execute that accounts application that we're going to use for our labs this afternoon. If I just click the debugger and launch the debugger for that accounts application, it'll really just execute the program like it normally would. And it'll go right on through until it terminates if I don't have a breakpoint set. Now what I could do is interrupt. There's an actual interrupt command that you can use to interrupt program execution, but it might be hard to find a good spot to do that. So most of the time people start debug sessions by going in before they launch the debugger and actually setting at least a couple of what I would call initial breakpoints. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. A lot of times what you'll do is go in and bring up the program module that contains the main main program block. That's a good place to start, and at least set maybe a breakpoint on that initial calling function there just to get things rolling. Now you can go ahead and set a lot of breakpoints before you ever initiate the debugger, or you can just set a couple and then go ahead and start your debug session, and then you can always create or set more breakpoints as you continue the debug session. So these are things you can do before and during the session. So earlier we talked about breakpoints. They arbitrarily stop program execution at a specific line of code. So when you go in and set a breakpoint, you're telling the debugger, stop here. Right? Doesn't matter what's going on, I want to stop at this particular line. And the whole idea is to give you a chance to get in there and look at the source code. One of the things that's kind of neat is that when it hits a breakpoint, it'll actually display the source that's being executed right there in Code Editor. So you can look at the source code that's currently being executed while you're suspended at the breakpoint, kind of poke around with the code there. You can look in the various views in the debugger while you're suspended, and you can see all the variables, the global variables, function level variables, local variables. You can see what the values are for those variables while you're suspended at the breakpoint. And then when you're satisfied, when you're finished looking, you can go ahead and resume execution with one of the debugger commands. And we'll see some of those here in a page or two. So that's the first, probably the first big feature is a breakpoint. So one thing that's a little different and a little strange sometimes sounding is that you actually usually set your first breakpoints before you actually kick off the debugger. So there's a lot of ways to set a breakpoint. Typically what I do is click in the Code Editor gutter. So you'll go in, for example, and open up the source module that has, let's say, the program main program block in it, and I'll go in there and find a good spot for a breakpoint and go ahead and set those initial breakpoints there. You can right-click on the line, and of course there's a context menu that has the option in it to set a breakpoint. You can see that here on the slide, add or delete breakpoint. F9 will set a breakpoint, and you can go to the debug menu at the top if you like and set a breakpoint. So there's 4 or 5 ways that you can set these. After you set a breakpoint, you can tell where it is. It's pretty easy to spot. Grab my highlighter here. Pretty easy to spot because it'll have this little red circle, right? So there'll be a red circle right there next to, in the gutter, right next to the line of code where you set the breakpoint. Now, if you want to delete the breakpoint, all you have to do is click on that red dot, and the red dot will disappear, and the breakpoint goes away. You can also disable a breakpoint. That way it keeps the breakpoint, but it actually will skip over it until you go in and enable it again. So the menu option again has the option to add or delete breakpoints, and if there's an existing breakpoint, that context menu will have the option to disable and enable the breakpoint. So far so good? Everybody okay with breakpoints?
Yeah.
Okay. So that's probably the first thing to know. That's how you can just get the program to stop at a certain place in the source code, and that gives you a chance to get in there and look at everything while the program is suspended. And when you're finished looking, you can go ahead and resume program execution with a command. Pretty straightforward. By the way, a few more things while I'm thinking about it. Breakpoints are saved. So when you finish a debug session, those breakpoints are actually saved. And let's say you come back again in 2 months and you're ready to do another debug session, maybe for a different bug that you found, and those breakpoints will be reactivated when you launch the debugger again. Also, they're private. So if you get in and debug the accounts application, for example, your breakpoints will be saved as private to you. Nobody else will have the same breakpoints. And the other thing, I guess, that's special about them is they're linked to a particular line in the source code. It's not a line number, right? It's actually the line of source code. So let's say you're debugging and you set a breakpoint at a specific line of source code, and then you go in later and add a few lines to the source code or delete a few lines while you're trying to fix the error. Well, that breakpoint will actually still be associated with the same line of source code, even though there's a different number of lines in the source code module. So it's linked to the actual line of source code, not a line number.
If that line of code gets deleted, then the breakpoint just gets deleted?
I assume it does. That's a good question. I'll test that. I hadn't tried that. What happens? I assume it would have to disappear, but yeah. I'll double check. One sec, I'm writing it down. That'll be something interesting to do. Okay, so that's a little bit about breakpoints. We'll see them lots of times during the session because they are pretty important. Now there's another feature that you can use to stop program execution, but this time it's not an arbitrary line of source. This is based on stopping program execution when a variable value changes. So that's the big difference. So it can actually stop program execution anywhere in the application or anywhere in the source code where that variable happens to be in scope, and when that variable changes, it will actually stop execution. So we don't actually see watch points in the lab today, but you will have a watch point in the lab for tomorrow so that you can monitor variables and actually stop the code or stop the execution of the program right there where it changes. And of course it displays the source code, so it makes it very easy to find the actual source code location where this variable maybe gets set to a bad value or an incorrect value. It makes errors really easy to find, or that's the benefit to it. So that's a watch point. Now watch points have one other big difference from breakpoints besides not just being in an arbitrary line of code. Watch points are not saved. When you finish the debug session, those watch points actually disappear. Same story for starting the session. You don't create watch points until the debug session is actually running. Everybody okay with that? So it's a little different. Breakpoints you can set in or out of the actual debug session, right? You don't even have to be running the debugger to set those initial breakpoints. But watch points can only be set while the debugger session is running, and then once the session ends, you've lost your watch points. So they're a little different from breakpoints. And the purpose, right?
In the old Informix debugger, I need to go further, but
that's okay.
Say something like break on a line if a value is equal to something.
Conditional, yes.
To a watch point.
It does, right? You can have a conditional watch point, right? So you can specify that it's based on an expression and a Boolean value, like if the expression is true. For example, if I is greater than 50, right? So there's based on a condition being true.
So that is equivalent to a watch point today.
It is. Breakpoints can do the same thing, by the way, right? So you can do a breakpoint, and we can create a conditional breakpoint so that the breakpoint doesn't stop the application unless a condition is true. And then you can do the same thing with a watch point.
In the old text debugger, all those commands were saved in the .4db file. And so you would save them between sessions. But
now the breakpoints will, right? The breakpoints are saved between sessions. It's only, not the watch points, right?
You can kind of emulate a watch point by having a breakpoint with a condition on it.
You could. The only difference, though, is, of course, the breakpoint's going to have to be at that, just this line of code, line of source code.
Right.
Yeah. But yes, you can.
Between sessions where the watch point cannot.
Correct.
Okay.
Now, one thing you could do, since you're asking about it, that makes me think, right? One thing you could do is create what they call a macro, a command macro, which it's just like it sounds. You can actually record the commands that you're issuing while you're in a debugger session. So you could replay your recording, so to speak, right? You could replay your macro. That might be an option for watch points. Okay.
Because you won't get this, but everybody else will. If you're debugging the com run, I mean, you could be debugging it for days on end. And when you come back, you want to be able to pick up where you left off. Or if another bug comes up, you want to be able to retain those breakpoints and watch points. But so that's why I was concerned about watch points couldn't be saved. But I think you've given me a workaround.
I hope so. Yeah, I think maybe the macro might work, and I'll check into that more, whether those macros, I believe that, those are saved to a file, and I believe you could replay those, but I will double check it after our session today, and I'll be able to tell you tomorrow.
Are you going to cover macros tomorrow?
I don't think I have them in the course, but I tell you what, I can add them real easily.
Or you can send it to me. And
okay. It would only be a page or so.
Or just point me to where I can get documentation on it.
Sure. I can show it to you. All right. No problem.
But this is Mark Hauser. I don't know if I haven't introduced myself yet. But
oh, okay.
so you know who you're talking to.
Wanting to know, huh? Okay. Let me write that down. I'll probably show it to everyone, though, because I can see where that would be a good thing for everybody to know how to do. Just a little oversight on my part. All right, let's take a look here at debugger views. See if I can get my mouse back. It kind of wandered off here. Debugger views. There's several different views, and this is not all of them, by the way. We'll see a couple of views tomorrow that kind of a little bit more advanced features, like that backtrace view I mentioned earlier, where you can see your function calls, the command views here, but there's a couple of views that I notice are missing, but we'll address those tomorrow. So the basic debugger views are here. The breakpoint view, so that you can see information on all your breakpoints. There's a data view, and that's where you can go to see the values of the program variables while you're monitoring program execution or suspended at a breakpoint or a watch point. Output view. The output view is just your general output view that you're probably already familiar with Studio, but it does also show output from the debugger as well. The command view is, I mentioned earlier, where you can go to look at the output from all of your debugger commands, but it also has that debugger prompt we saw a few minutes ago in the screenshot, where if you do want to go in and enter a command manually, you can do it right there inside of Studio. So that's the command view. Here's the breakpoints view. Seems awfully small. It looked really large when I put the screenshot in there, but now it looks really tiny when I'm trying to tell you about it. This is the breakpoints view, and you can see down here at the bottom of the screen. Grab a highlighter here so I can point stuff out. First thing before I forget about it, right here at the top of the breakpoint view is an integrated toolbar. So that's a little shortcut that you can use up there. Those little icons, you can use them to delete all the breakpoints at once if you want to. There's an option for that. There's an option to disable all the breakpoints. You can delete an individual breakpoint with one of these options up here. I think it's the one here on the end. They're so tiny it's hard to tell. This option, this little icon at the far left up here in the toolbar, is an option to go to the source code. So if you wanted to go to the source code where the breakpoint is actually set and review that source code, you can just highlight the breakpoint in the bottom here, down here, and then click the little go to source code icon, and it'll take you right to the source code where that breakpoint has been set. You can tell which breakpoints are enabled and disabled over here in the far left column. The ones that are completely red are enabled breakpoints, and this one here that looks like it has an empty center or a hollow center, that's a disabled breakpoint. So it's still there.
Zoom in on that?
Gosh, I can't, well, I don't think so.
Is there a view option? Or? Oh, there's zoom up on the left. Is that for me or for you?
I don't have a zoom on the left, but it must be for you. Give it a try and see if maybe you can zoom it up a little bit.
Yeah, but the you'd have to do it on your side because the quality of the picture didn't.
It's not so good. All right, let me get rid of my marker for a second. Give it a try here. Ugh. That didn't help, did it? I'm looking. Let me see what I can find. Options, view.
Yeah, it should be under view. If it's anywhere.
Yeah, I don't have a zoom under mine. I guess I don't have that option. Seems odd, doesn't it? Maybe I'm just overlooking it, but I sure don't see it.
That's okay. Thanks for trying.
Yeah, also, when we finish going through these slides, I'll pop into Studio, so hopefully it'll be bigger then. We'll hope so anyway. All right. So here is, grab my highlighter again. Every breakpoint has an ID, so you can see there's like a 1, 2, 4 there it looks like, or maybe that's a 3. But a breakpoint, when you delete it, of course, gets deleted and the ID goes with it. So it's possible to have skipped numbers like that. Here's a little column where you can enable and disable breakpoints just by selecting the little checkbox there, or selecting and unselecting. Here is the file that the breakpoint is in, the source file where you've set the breakpoint, the line number of the breakpoint, and the name of the function that the breakpoint is in. And earlier we were talking about conditional breakpoints, being able to only stop program execution if a certain condition is true. Like let's say a variable has reached a certain number, like if I equals 3, for example. You could see that condition right here. Now we'll talk about conditional breakpoints tomorrow in more detail, but that's where you would see it and where you can set the condition just by clicking on it, and it'll show like on a little ellipsis. Or you can right-click on it, highlight the line for the breakpoint, right-click, and there's an option there, I think, that says Edit Condition. So you edit or create a conditional breakpoint right here. Hit count tells you how many times, in the code that this particular breakpoint has been hit, right? So iterated, the program has had multiple iterations through that breakpoint, that line of code where the breakpoint is set. And you can even specify what they call skip hits, which means that I don't want the breakpoint to be activated until it's already, the code has already been hit for this breakpoint X times. So that way, if you know, for example, that a particular problem doesn't come up until maybe the third time through a function, for example, you can skip the first 2 hits, and that way it doesn't cost you a lot of time having to go in and use the commands to start the program back up again. So it's just a time saver. All right, anything else there that I missed? I think that's everything. So that's the breakpoints view. And just keep in the back of your mind, that's where you would go to, of course, monitor your breakpoints. You can enable and disable and delete them here. And this is also where you go to create conditional breakpoints as well. Now here's the data view. The data view is where you go to monitor your variables. That's probably the easiest way to think of it. So the data view is where the variables are. So when you suspend a program at a breakpoint, or when it gets suspended at a breakpoint or a watch point, or if you deliberately suspend execution with the interrupt command that we'll see later, you can go to the data view and see the values of all your variables while you're suspended at that breakpoint or watch point or whatever it happens to be. So it breaks them down by variable location, grabbing my highlighter here. So here's local variables, module variables, and then global at the bottom. So you've got folders for all of those, so you can focus in on the ones you want to look at and close the others. But notice at the very top here there's a folder called user variables. Now user variables initially doesn't have anything in it, and it's strictly there as a convenience for you. Like if you've got an application, you know, that's fairly complex and has dozens and dozens of variables, you might be interested in 3 or 4 of those variables, and you have to keep digging for them by opening up these other folders like local or global variables and looking for them every time you want to check the value. What you can do is you can go in and right-click on any of these variables that are in these other folders like local, module, or global, and there's an option when you right-click to add or copy them to the user variable folder. And when you put them in the user variable folder, you can see they start at the top and they're easy to see. And that's all that is. So user variables is just a place where you can put important variables that you're trying to really keep an eye on, just so they're easier to see. Nothing real special about it, except it's kind of an easy place to find things. This is where, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. What's the difference between copy and add?
Good question, right? Copy means that the variable is in scope, right, and you can see it. Like under local variables or global variables, you can find it and copy it up there. Add is what you can do if the variable's not in scope yet, right, and it doesn't show up. You can go ahead and add it.
Okay.
Yeah, just make sure you don't have any typos. That's my problem.
If it's not in scope, you would have to type it in?
Yeah, you can type it in, and when it does come into scope, it shows up there. Or it highlight, you know, it'll be grayed out until it's in scope, and then you can see it. It actually creates like a little exclamation mark, you know, whenever a variable is actually in the process of changing or active.
Yeah, if the same variable name is in different modules.
It's okay, yeah. Yeah.
Which one?
It shows up in both, actually. Like, for example, let's say, what is that, tchar? Do you see that variable there on the screen, tchar, tdate?
Yes.
Let's say I right-clicked on that tchar variable and told it to copy that to user variables, or added it, you know, maybe I typed it in to user variables. So it's actually going to be in both places. So whenever it does change that variable, for example, or something happens with that variable, it will actually highlight it in both locations.
Right, but if that tchar is a global, what if I have 2 functions that have, let's say I have a tchar variable in those functions, a local tchar. I mean, it's not smart to have the same name, local and global, but if I did, how would I identify, let's say I had 2 different functions and the global. So now I have 3 tchars.
Right.
How do I distinguish between those 3?
I don't believe you could distinguish here in the data tab, right? There wouldn't be any way to distinguish here because it's just strictly the names of the variables that are in scope. But you could look over, for example, in your backtrace view, for example, to identify what function you're currently in. you could do that, and you can see the list of functions and variables in the code structure view while the application is there. So you could check your code structure view.
So in the
I don't know if that would help though. At the,
yeah.
all the
In the data view, you can't qualify a variable with the function that it's in.
not that I know of. That's a good question.
Now, if I did add t char to my user variables, as I go through the program and I hit one of those functions that has it defined just locally, would it show up under user variables?
If you had, I mean, it will all, if you've added it to user variables, it stays in user variable. But the answer is I don't know whether it would highlight, whether it would ungray itself. It'll be grayed out when it's not in scope. But I don't know if it's smart enough, honestly. I will have to do a test.
When I'm in that local function, in user variables, is it going to show me the local value or the global value? Given they're actually two different variables.
Well, I would assume it would have to depend on which one, if you copied it out of there, it might be smart enough to know. But if you just added it by typing it in, there would be no way it could know. So in other words, my guess is as good as yours right now, and I'll have to test it. So
don't use unique. It's better to use unique names.
That would be a good answer for it. But let me see if I can find out. Maybe I can set up a little test because that is a curious thing. I'm just trying to figure.
The reason that's important is sometimes we're debugging existing code. We're not in the process of creating new code. So we have the option of naming variables.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, let me see if I can find out. That shouldn't be that hard to figure out. So I'll do a little test here. I'm just trying to write it down so I'll remember what I was trying to do later.
I would expect it to follow the scoping rules, and the local variable would be the one that it would show. But
yeah, it might actually be dynamic and change as you branch into a subroutine, and another version of the variable becomes in scope.
Exactly. But if it's not documented, we just have to play with it and see what it does.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll see if I can set up a little test this afternoon too. Maybe I'll have an answer for you tomorrow. More than one with the same name. Just trying to write this down so I'll remember what the question was later. Okay.
Well, that's actually kind of a global and a local with the same name. It happens. Not that we don't do it, but it's more common to have the same name in two different functions.
Right, right. That's pretty common, I think. I've seen that a lot.
So if you're in neither function, you want to add it to the user variable folder. I'm just wondering which one it's going to pick up.
That's for stop point we're talking about, right?
I think
because
he's just
on
talking.
a watch point, it gets even more complicated.
No, I'm just in the data in the data tab, just to follow the value of the variable.
Yeah,
now,
if we set a watch point to watch a variable and there's two occurrences of the variable within the executable, then I wonder what that would do.
Now that does activate. If I'm following what you're asking, I kind of was writing for a second there, but if you have the same name of the variable in two different functions, it activates that variable for both functions. Now that I've seen.
So when you're in function A, the user variable is going to be the value in function A.
Right.
When you step into function B, so you're out of function, give you the value in function B.
Right. Yep.
Okay.
It does. It does. So I'll double check that, but I think I've seen that a bunch. So I will double check it, but I'm pretty sure that's what happens there. Again, I'll double check all this and get back with you tomorrow. All right. Let's see. So that puts us here, I believe. We're still in the data tab. Let me make sure I've got everything covered. Notice I have circled the edit value. So earlier we said that you could suspend at a breakpoint or a watch point, for example, or even just interrupt program execution. And you could take a look at your variables, and if you wanted to resume execution with a different variable value just for testing purposes, you can change it here. So you just right-click the variable that you want to change. There's an edit value option, and you just type in what you want to change it to, and then you go ahead and continue your program execution. And it'll go ahead and start back up again with these new values. So I think that's one of the neater functions with the debugger, is to be able to do that, neater features. So you do that here.
Especially when you're trying to alpha test it, you know, it's from our perspective, it's much better to just force the values to make sure the code works rather than trying to emulate the QA department and test it how they would test it.
Right. It's faster, you know, just to change it in here, you know, and just see what happens while you're right there in the session.
In the old text debugger, there was a let statement. That go away in Genero?
I don't know of a let statement, but most of the functionality from the 4GL debugger is here. It just sometimes is done a little differently. So I'll have to look up the let statement and see what that does.
It does the same thing. It lets you change the value of a variable.
Okay, so I'm assuming that this is just how we do it. We do things, you know, a little differently with this debugger, but most of the functionality is there.
Because when we talked about the command line, I've had instances where I've typed something in, the command that I thought would work, and you hit return and nothing happens.
Okay.
Like that, it doesn't understand that command.
Right. Right. If you hit return and nothing happens, that's probably what it means, because every other command I've typed in always has some sort of output. So.
Well, I believe let is one of those commands.
Okay. Well, I'll find the equivalent for you.
Which is how we would variables in the old debugger.
Right. I wonder if it's maybe just edit now. I can look it up though. I'll look it up. All right. I think we're good here on this page, so let's go ahead and pop on over to the next one. So these two are just real quick ones. The output and task manager view, there's nothing unique or special about these views for the debugger. They're the same views you have with Studio in general. But worth mentioning, here's the output tab, you know, displays Studio messages for the debugger as well as without the debugger. But it does have the filter option. There's a little filter that you can use. You can see that here in the left-hand side. So if you wanted to, I haven't ever found it to be necessary, but if you wanted to, there's an option where you only see debug messages. So if you're in the middle of a debug session, that might be something you want to do. I haven't ever felt the need to do that because I don't use the output view very much. I use all these other views. There is a task manager view. There's nothing really unique about the task manager view as far as the debugger is concerned. What you could do though here is highlight or select the task, the debugger task, and you can abort it from here. See the little abort icon up in the corner? I never use that either, to be honest with you. When I get ready to stop a session, I use it here in the toolbar over here on the left-hand side. Up at the top, there's the same icon. And you can also do it under the debug menu option. It's abort last task, I believe. So either place or all three places you can use to stop a debug session when you're finished debugging.
Does that imply you can have two debugger sessions running at the same time? If they're separate tasks?
Well, I suppose you could. I haven't done that, but I don't know. You can certainly execute the same application more than once, so I assume you could the debugger, but I haven't tried. I'll try that too. It would be interesting, wouldn't it?
Yes, it would.
I'll see what happens.
I don't know if it'd be useful, but just the fact separate tasks, why not have multiple?
Right. I don't know. We'll just have to find out. All right. So that's the output and task manager view. Nothing unique really there for the debugger. Now here's the command view we've been talking about a little bit. So here we finally get to see it. Over here on the far right-hand side, up here at the top is the command prompt. So you can type in your commands manually there. If you want to look them up, for example, in the documentation and try them manually, you can do that here. But you also use the command view a lot of times to see the output for commands that you've entered using debug menu options. Or,
I can't see that.
Say that again?
I can't see that.
Oh, is it too small?
Yeah, all of it's too small. I can't really make out it. I can make out a couple of words, but it's not very effective.
Right.
Maybe we can spend a minute and try to see if we can expand this. It's sort of taking from the lesson.
Okay. Well, I tell you what, it's 12:15, so it's probably a good time maybe to take a little break. Would you like to take a little break and I'll tinker with it and see if I can get it to be bigger?
You might have to go into the document itself, the PowerPoint document, and just expand that window possibly, but I'm not sure. I don't work with PowerPoint too much.
Yeah.
Or can you bring up the Genero Studio?
Sure.
And then switch to it?
You betcha.
Maybe that would be.
You want to hang on for a second while we do that and see if it looks better?
Yes.
All right. Get out of here. Find our... Is that any bigger?
Yes, quite a bit.
It is, really.
Nice.
Okay. All right, well, hang on one second. Let me get my slides up. Would you rather do it this way? We can just look at it, and I'll pull my slides up so we don't miss anything and put them on another screen just so I don't miss something. Now, do you still see my studio screen, or do you see the slides?
I see the studio screen.
See the studio.
Okay, good. All right. I wasn't sure when I moved it whether it would focus back in on that. All right, so here's the command view. There's the command line option, right, where you can type in your commands manually.
Not centered fully, I guess.
Is that better?
Yeah, move it over to the right a little bit.
To the right. How's that?
A little more.
Better?
A little more. Just a hair bit more.
There?
Yeah, like a quarter of an inch more.
All right.
Right there. Is that full screen for everyone now?
No, actually, we lost about half on the right-hand side.
Oh, okay. So I wonder if everybody's got a different resolution. Scott sent me a note and said probably the problem is you guys might be on a lower resolution than I am. So I wonder maybe I should...
I don't have a widescreen either.
Oh, we do.
Okay.
Yeah,
all right.
That's
That
one of the standards over at TSA.
Because we can see your desktop and about, I don't know, 20 or 30 of your icons.
Okay, right. Over on the left there, yeah.
And then the window is shifted way to the right.
Okay, well that's what's happened then. So it looks like most of you are seeing it okay. I tell you what, let's do, why don't we take like a couple of minute break and I'll change my resolution, lower my resolution I guess it would be, and see if I can't make things bigger that way.
Do you have a widescreen, by the way?
I do have, but it doesn't seem to...
Okay, that's why SDS is seeing it the same way you are, and I am not.
Well,
I'm not... The resolution will help out.
No, I'm not displaying it on the widescreen, though.
Oh.
I'm displaying it just on my
that's
laptop
like
screen.
That left half of your screen is cut off when it's in that position right there. I don't know how it's recording for the other folks that aren't here either, so I'm not sure.
When I look at I've got a little option that says audience view where I've seen what you should be seeing, and it looks fine.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so I think it might just be yours. Is anybody else having trouble with it?
There's no one else over here in the TSA office.
Oh, okay.
Oh, I'm okay, Blair.
I know, but you're on the laptop,
Yeah.
so yeah. Huh.
Okay. Well, shoot. All right, well.
Oh, there's a zoom over here. Maybe I can, it says 100% right now. Maybe I can just make my screen.
150% maybe, or something?
Yeah. And
okay, give that a try real quick and just see if that makes any difference.
okay, it's centered on your screen right now?
It is pretty much centered.
So I have to go down. Let's try 75%. Oh, that did it. I took it down to 75% and that did it.
Well, good. Okay. Great. All right. I wasn't quite sure what we could do about that, so I feel better. All right. So let's see.
SDS, are you guys seeing it centered or off to the right now?
It's off to the right.
All right.
Yeah, but I switched from 75 back to 100, and now it's off to the right again. It might just be some issue with my current
All right.
PC.
How's that?
Now you moved it over more to the left, so you only see a few of your icons.
Okay.
Yeah,
But
so
you can
move it
see
a little
them
more
all.
to the left, guys?
Sure.
Better?
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah. Yeah, I can see it now.
Okay, good.
Okay.
All right.
I think my zoom was messed up when I was trying to zoom to match your font earlier in the lesson, so maybe that was
Right. Let me see what happens when I maximize this guy.
That's perfect.
Good? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, I'll have to go back to 75% now.
Okay, well, we'll just try to get my mouse back. I keep losing it here. There we go. We'll just use this and instead of the actual slides for a few pages so that you can see a little bit better. So here's that command view we were talking about. So when you do type in a command during a debug session, I don't really well, doesn't go too well. But anyway, you can see the output here.
I think you have to start a debug session.
Well, I'm already in the debug session, but it's paused because it's at an interactive dialogue statement right now. Is the problem? See this? That's probably a good thing to talk about. Look right up here at the left. Let me grab my highlighter. So right up here at the top, see how all the debug icons, that's one way you can tell real quickly what's going on up here at the top in the toolbar. The only one that's enabled right now is the interrupt, the little pause symbol up here. And that tells, after you've messed with the debugger a bit, that tells you real quickly that you're probably at an interactive dialogue statement, like a menu command or a construct or something like that. So right now it's waiting for me to interact with the program, and then it will come back to debugger control, which actually is something we're going to talk about here in a slide or two, so that actually might be a good segue. But anyway, when I get ready to resume program execution after my interactive dialogue statement is completed, then I could type in commands like continue, for example, or step command, next command, those types of things. All right, let's see. All right, well, the next topic that we were going to cover was tracing logic, actually going through and tracing logic. So let me see. Get my mouse back here. It's being really stubborn today. There we go. See if I can get this to where you can see it. Go through a few slides and then we'll pop back into Studio. Let me try something else here. Right now I've got my slideshow set a certain way. Let me try a different setting on my slideshow real quick. So bear with me one second. See if that helps your view. Let's set up. Is that better? Of course, it would start at the beginning again. The only problem is I lose my
We
option.
can't slide at one time.
Yeah, and I don't have the option to move forward in the slides either, which is kind of a nuisance. So I don't guess we'll be able to use that. All right, well, it was worth a try. Well, real quick, let me try this one before I give up anyway. There we go. I got my arrows back. Now, is that any bigger?
You have to get to the same screen we're looking at, the head that's small.
Okay.
Print.
Yeah.
All this I can be fine.
Really? Well, good.
I don't know if it's
get up here where
the larger font. So.
Right. How does that one look? A little better or not as?
Oh, that's it's pretty tiny. Hold on a second. Let me put this.
Here's the breakpoints view. Let me pop up here where we can get to that command. There we were. It's pretty small. Just to get this whole screenshot on the page, it had to be fairly small.
That might be a little bit better than before.
Okay.
Still kind of hard.
Right. I'm afraid that might be about as good as it's going to get.
Okay. Thanks for trying.
Okay. All right. Well, there's the command view and some examples of some commands. And honestly, I use the command view quite a lot to see the output from commands that you set with toolbar options or even the debug menu. A lot of times you still look in the command view to see the output of those commands. For example, the up command that we're going to look at tomorrow, when you use the up command, you immediately go to the command view to see what gets output from the up command. So the command view is really good for looking at the output from debugger commands that you want to see. All right, so topic 2 is on tracing program logic. So it's more or less emulating what you would do in the lab, but there are some things in the lab that we won't do here. So we mentioned earlier that there's 2 basic purposes for the debugger. One, of course, is to debug programs that have errors or logic conditions. Another reason to use the debugger might just be to familiarize yourself with some code. Maybe you're responsible now for some legacy code and you really don't know what that code does all that well. So one way to find out quickly is to use the debugger, and you can use these breakpoints and use these views that we've been talking about to be able to tell what's going on in that application. A lot easier than going in, for example, and putting in a bunch of display statements or something like that. So we can use the debugger to review the source code as it executes. We can use these debugger commands to step through one line at a time or multiple lines at a time. We can use breakpoints and watch points to interrupt the program, give us a chance to focus in on the source code, our program variables and their values, and then come back in and resume execution and move on again. Monitor and change variables. We talked about being able to do that, and also being able to tell how we got here by going out and looking at some of these views like the backtrace view, or looking at the output from the up command to see what function calls have been done since the application started. So that's a good way of figuring out how an application gets to a certain point, what functions are involved. This sample that we were talking about earlier was actually created by our developers for a studio tool called BAM, our Business Application Modeling, and it's primarily to demonstrate this application modeling feature. just goes to show, though, that it doesn't really matter how the applications are created. It doesn't matter if you use a modeling tool like business application modeling, or whether it's 4GL or BDL, you can still debug it with the debugger. So Studio, when you install it now, comes with a lot of sample databases and applications that you can play with to get more familiar with BDL or get more familiar with Studio. So we're using the Office Store database and application. There are actually a couple of applications that come with Office Store. There's the Accounts application and the Orders application. And for all of our screenshots and labs, we're just using the Accounts application. Just a real simple generated application that lets you insert, update, and delete customers, right? Customer accounts. So that's what we'll be using for all of our demos and for our screenshots.
Will you use the same thing for the lab as well?
We do. It's for the same thing as the lab, so we need to figure out.
I have to figure out how, yeah.
Yeah, figure out how to get that going. All right, so kind of switching gears here and talking about what steps we would go through to actually go through and try to trace the logic in a program, actually use the debugger for that purpose. So earlier we talked about breakpoints can be set before a debugger session, or you can set them during the debugger session as well. And it's almost always a good idea to go ahead and set initial breakpoints before you even launch the debugger. And again, if you don't do that, then the program, even in debug mode, just executes normally, so it can actually terminate before you get a chance to actually view or really monitor anything. So a good idea is to go in and at least set a few initial breakpoints, and then go ahead and start your debug session, and then you can set additional breakpoints if you need to once you start the session. So that's what we mean here when we say debug sessions start with breakpoints, talking about setting these initial breakpoints just so that the program does halt at a certain point to give you a chance to look more closely at the source code or set some more breakpoints or whatever it is that you want to do. So a good starting place if you're just trying to trace the logic in a program, or even if you're debugging sometimes, is to go in and set breakpoints at function calls. Those are kind of obvious, easy things to do. So function calls, function entry points, the very beginning of the function's a good starting point. You can always move those later if you want to. And a real nice feature is being able to use the code structure view to navigate between functions real quickly and pop the source code for those functions up on the code editor view so that you can real quickly go in and set the breakpoints. And I'll demonstrate those for you real quickly as well when we finish the chapter. So here is the Accounts application, account.4gl. We've selected here. Grab a marker so I can point stuff out. So that's the application. Notice we're not even in the debugger at this point. We're just looking at the source code in code editor. And you can go out here and just click in the gutter here, adjacent to a line of code where you want to set a breakpoint, and that's what they've done here down at the bottom. So again, you can use the gutter, just click in the gutter to set a breakpoint, or you can use your menu or toolbar options to do that. So a good place to start if you're unfamiliar with the program is just starting with the source module that has the main program block, and that's what we've done here. And we've set the breakpoint at the first real function call. There's a couple of housekeeping calls here, just some built-in methods, but the first breakpoint is actually here on this first real function, a call account form underscore UI underscore UI open form. Now as soon as you open the source code for a module, over here in the code structure view, you'll see your module that's open up here at the top. You see your functions. In this case, we just have the main program block listed. And then your variables are listed. And then you can't see it here because I've covered it up, but we also, it looks like, have an external function as well. Get rid of this highlighter real quick. So here we've got one breakpoint here on this account form UI open form function call. So here's the code structure view kind of in action over here. Now they've opened up the account.4gl source file, and as soon as you open it up, all the functions show up over in the code structure view. And a really good quick shortcut is to go over here into the code structure view, and you can click on the functions in the code structure view, and that will cause the actual source code to be displayed in Code Editor. And that's what we see down here in this second screenshot. So they've actually clicked on this account form UI open form. It's opened up the source code, which notice has opened up another source module in Code Editor because that particular function is an external function. It's in a different source module, and it displays the code. Now, one thing that I probably ought to tell you is that external source code file that has that external function in it does have to be part of the project, right? It has to be available in the project before the source code will be opened up. So sometimes it might be convenient to actually add files to the project structure so that you have some of these conveniences, like automatically opening up the source code so that you can go in and view the functions and create your breakpoints. So this is an external function. It's automatically been opened up and displaying the source for that function. So I could go right in here now and click right there in the gutter adjacent to that function to set my next breakpoint. Very fast way to go in and set initial breakpoints. Being a little bit stubborn about turning loose of that marker. Okay. So here's starting the debug session. So at this point, we've actually opened up our first source module that has the main program block in it. We've gone in and set at least one initial breakpoint, maybe several, using the code structure view, and now we're ready to actually launch the debug session. So just like everything else, there's 3 or 4 ways you can do it. Typically, I just right-click on the application and, whoops, didn't mean to do that. Right-click on the application. There we go. And there's a debug option in the context menu. You can also get to it from the debug menu up at the top, if you like. And there's even a debug icon there.
But that debug icon only debugs the current application.
Correct. So if the account application is not the default application, I guess they call it, right? If it's not the default application, then it'll debug the wrong one. So I don't use that icon very often.
Yeah, don't either.
Right. I've kind of lost my
Ms. Delaney, if you do not wish to use that toolbar, you can, even if you want to debug an application that's not set as your default application, if you right-click on that application that you want to debug and then click on debug, it will debug whichever one you pick.
Right, yeah. So yes, that's what I typically do, right? I don't use the little debug icon up there that much because I'm not always aware of which application's the default. I usually just click on the application in the application node, right-click on it, and there's a debug option. Thanks, Delane. Glad you're back. Huh?
If you've got a rather large project, you'll not see everything on that project manager window.
Ah, okay. That makes sense. All right, so once you launch the debugger, of course, the program's going to go ahead and be launched as well when you launch the debugger. And it's going to stop at the first breakpoint. So if you've gone in and set those initial breakpoints, it's going to stop program execution, and then it's just going to sit there and wait for you to do something. So this is your opportunity, of course, to go in and use your debugger views to look at variable values that we talked about earlier. You can edit variable values if you're to that point. If you're just in here to trace logic, you're probably not in there to change program variable values or anything of that nature. You're just trying to see the flow, the program flow, to see what that application does. So that's where we're focusing today. So we've got some commands here we can use to move the execution forward. We've got the next command here. We've got a step in and step out command. We'll talk more about those later, but the step in and step out command lets you step into a function so that you can actually see the source code for that function as it's executing. If you don't click step in when you get to a function call, if you don't have a breakpoint set somewhere in that function, you won't see it at all, right? It'll actually just sit there at the line of code prior to the function call, right there at the function call, and wait for that function to finish and for execution to come back to the calling program. So you can go about it two ways, right? You could set a breakpoint inside that function, maybe at the function entry point, and that would cause the source code to be displayed when it enters the function so that you can kind of monitor and watch what's going on. Or you can use this step in command if you like. Either method will work. I have a tendency to set breakpoints, but both of them are perfectly okay. The step out command will actually bring you back out of a function that you've stepped into before that function even finishes and return execution back to the calling function, right? Put you back out to the calling function. The continue command actually continues program execution, and it'll keep going at that point up to the next breakpoint or watch point if you have watch points set, or until the program actually terminates, whichever comes first, right? If you have additional breakpoints set, it'll stop there, or watch points, and if you don't have any more set, it will actually finish the application and terminate naturally. Here's a better picture of the commands. The step in, the step out, the continue command. We've covered those pretty well. And this is what we actually had happen a few minutes ago when I went to the studio interface and I went in and actually launched the debugger, and then the commands didn't work for a second or two and we were trying to figure that out. This is what happened, right? It actually reached an interactive dialogue statement in the application, and when you get to one of those, it actually switches control away from the debugger and back to the application, waiting for you to perform some sort of action. Now you can hit, at that point, the interrupt command if you wanted to, so that would interrupt the application again and bring you back out to the debugger commands so that you could use debugger commands. But essentially you're not going to move forward in the program execution until you interact with that application. So it could be a menu statement, for example, some sort of an input array, construct, something along those lines. So whenever it reaches an interactive dialogue statement, that switches control away from the debugger, and it's just as though you weren't even using the debugger, right? You make your menu selections, you can enter data just as you would with a normally executing application. But you do have the benefit of being able to monitor what has happened up to that point with your views that you have, like your data view, for example. And you can manipulate variables while you're sitting at that point. When you've finished tracing the logic for an application, or you're finished with your debug session for whatever reason you're doing it, you can abort the debug session with the little stop sign icon. We talked earlier that there's 2 or 3 places you can find that. You can find it in Task Manager. I never use it there. I usually just click on it right there in the toolbar. There's also a debug menu option, abort last task. So any of those methods will stop the debug session. All right, so let's pop into the debugger again. I think you can see it better than you can. Here's the account screen. Find my studio. There he is. Okay. So let me go ahead and abort this one real quick so you can see some of the things we talked about. Everybody see that okay again? Do I have it centered where you can see it?
Yes.
Okay. Awesome. All right. So here we are. We've got the Office Store project up. And let's say we don't know anything about this accounts application, so we thought we might use the debugger to go in and do a little bit of logic tracing. So earlier we talked about a good place to start out with something like that is to find the source file that has the main program block in it. There's no hard and fast rule like that, but that might be a good place to start, kind of an obvious place to start. So here it is, account.4gl. Let me see if I can make it bigger for you. There we go. And then I'm just going to kind of look over this main program block.
Actually,
oh,
yeah,
is that
actually
worse?
Perfect before.
Oh, is that better?
Well, if you're just looking at the program block, that's all right. But before I could see the whole thing.
Oh, there we go. How's that?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. So I'm going to scroll through here and look for places to put these initial breakpoints we talked about. So here's a good one here. Right, we've got a function call, this account form UI open form function call, and that's really about all we have in this main program block, except maybe a little bit of housekeeping calls up here. What I can use though is my code structure view to do a little bit more exploring. So if I go over here in the code structure view, you can see my main program block, but I can also see that there's an external function. This account form UI open form is external, and I can click on that and notice that since I have added this external module, you can see it over here in the code structure view now. Make that a little bigger. Well, it doesn't get bigger, but account form UI.4gl, and now it's in code structure view and I can see all the variables and functions for that. Close this output so we can see it even better. So there's all kinds of functions I can see. So if I want to go in and put some more breakpoints in so that I can kind of examine the code as I run my debug session, it makes it real easy. So here's the one I've already created a breakpoint on, this UI open form function. But I can just click on this next function, this account form UI automaton. It's kind of hard to say. And that will bring up the source code for it. So here it is. So I can just pop right over here now and click in the gutter and create my next breakpoint. Here's another one, UI display. Maybe I want to create a breakpoint there. It pops up the source code for it when I click on it, and I can just go over here and create another breakpoint. So I think that code structure view makes it really nice to navigate through your functions so that you can actually get into the source code there and set those breakpoints at convenient places before you actually launch that debug session. And when you have them, at least a few of them set, you can go ahead and initiate the debug session. And again, I just right-click on the application, use the debug option, and there it launches the debugger and sets up all my views. So there's my breakpoints view. So there's my 3 breakpoints. Notice it highlights the breakpoint that's currently active. So when it launched the debugger, there we go, trying to find that dashboard up there. When it launched the debugger there, it went ahead and started executing the program, and of course it stopped at that first breakpoint, which happens to be on line 32. Count form UI open form. So we're sitting there, and this is my opportunity to go in and I can look at the variables. There's my global variables, local variables, action no, error no. I could copy these, or if I wanted to the user variables, copy to user variable, and now they show up there, so they're easy to see. I can disable breakpoints from inside here if I like, or I can delete them all. Right? Do you want to delete them all? I'm going to be rash and delete all my breakpoints. But at this point here, I'm in my debug session, and I use the toolbar quite a bit here, but you can use the debug menu as well to do a next. Right, so if I did a next here, I really wouldn't see much because we're sitting at a function call, and it happens to be, the last one. So instead, this would be a good place for me to use the step in. Right? So I'm going to step into this function, and as soon as I click that step in button, notice it popped the source up for that module that function is in. This account form, get this down where you can see account form UI.4GL source module is opened, and now I can see I'm right here at the top of this function, right at the function entry point. I can go one line at a time here with this next option. I'm using the toolbar icon, or I can use continue, and since I don't have any more breakpoints, it's going to go all the way up to my first interactive dialog statement. So I'm going to hit continue, and notice everything kind of gets grayed out. I don't have any active command options up here in my toolbar except the interrupt, and that tells me that I have reached an interactive dialog statement. Right? Menu is sitting here waiting for me to make a choice. If I hit interrupt, I can pop right back out of that, and now I'm sitting at the dialog statement. It's a display array. So here again, I can go in and make subsequent breakpoints. I can do it right here in the code if I'm patient enough. I don't think I'm going to be patient enough. Or I can cheat a little bit and go back over here to my structure view, code structure view. There we go. So you can set your initial breakpoints, and then while you're actually in the debug session, you can go in and add a breakpoint or a watch point, or if you interrupt the session, you can go in and set additional breakpoints if you want to. Now I'll go in and maybe pick the modify option. Now see, I'm back to my debugger session because I've actually selected an action. So if I do a next, it tells me let next action equals see action update, right? Because I hit the modify button, on action modify. So you can just go back and forth like that from interacting with the application to the debugger. Make additional breakpoints if you want to, go line by line to see what happens next, or use the continue button, especially if you have, let's say like we did a minute ago, if you've set multiple breakpoints. The continue option's fine because it'll just take you to the next breakpoint and it will stop there. I'm going to hold off on watch points though because we actually talk about watch points tomorrow, so I'll kind of reserve those for tomorrow. Okay, well that's a pretty good introduction. If you do your lab this afternoon, you'll actually walk through just a short piece of the accounts application. It's not an exhaustive and exhausting lab. It's just a small section of code just to give you an idea of these commands, like how to set initial breakpoints, how to start the debug session, set additional breakpoints, monitor variables, and that type of thing. Okay, any questions before we take a look at the lab? I'm going to pop this. Goodness, that doesn't look good. I have a feeling it will not go. Oh, it did. Good. I was afraid it would not go to the current slide. I was afraid it would go all the way to the beginning again. All right. Has anybody downloaded Lab 1 from your materials link?
I downloaded everything, but I couldn't execute it.
You couldn't, oh, you couldn't execute the application?
The application setup script, right?
Okay, okay. All right. And the lab looked okay? Did you open the lab and take a look at it?
No.
No, okay. I think it should be fine. It's just a plain old Word document, so it should be fine. Delane, are you still there?
Yeah.
Oh, not Lelaine. I'm sorry. Delane. With a D.
Okay.
Sorry. I forgot your names are so similar. Delane, are you there?
I'm here.
Awesome. They're having some problems getting the Office Store application working, and I was hoping maybe you could help us with that. Do you have time to look into it with us?
Are you not able to create the database? What seems to?
It couldn't access a directory. It's probably a server setup issue. I might not have permission. I just didn't have time to play with it.
Access what directory?
Here the error is, it says path is not accessible from the server. Check your mount points. And the line above that says files with a capital F, samples, databases, Office Store, Office Store.4db error, GF6001.
Okay, so you're not looking at the exercises on your local machine. You're trying to access a remote system to look at the exercises?
We only have a development environment set up on a Citrix server. There's some complexity to that. Has anyone else been able to set this up that's on the Citrix server?
I have the same problem as you do, Blair, so we're on the same spot.
Oh, and did yours set up successfully?
No.
Oh, you got the same error?
Yeah. Because as I said, this was set up by FDS according to the path they made for us,
Yeah.
for the GSD, so I don't know if there's any options for us to actually play around with it, to be honest. So.
Yeah, maybe what we can do is just use the commands that we learned today in one of our existing programs.
Yeah,
I just didn't want to make a whole project that is setting something up that we're not going to use.
Yeah, I don't want to use that because I'm afraid that it might mess up the GSD connections or setup that we have that we're using for work. So.
Yeah, this is our production environment or development environment, whatever.
Okay, yeah, you could certainly use some of those commands in your development environment. Just, you're not actually changing anything. You're just kind of stepping through. So
yeah,
just kind of have to kind of make up your own lab, I guess, to just try some of the commands.
Bring your own.
Probably help you set that up, but that's going to be up to Jeff or whoever's in charge of all the configuration, and permission granting and stuff like that. So,
Yeah, that's actually our IT department here at FDS that would have to set up the database initially.
Yeah, I don't think it's worth the effort. It's not like it's an ongoing thing. The few commands we learned from this debugger, I think I can try on an existing program. Unless if, the people that aren't here right now might need that in the future. I'm not sure. I can probably do without that.
Yeah. I think it would, since this is being recorded, I think it would translate over to your applications just like you're going to do it. So.
Yeah, that should be fine.
Okay. Is everyone in the same boat? Everyone from the different locations, are you all in the same boat where you don't have a local copy?
We have local copies, but we haven't even tried.
Anybody have a local copy that you could actually use to do the labs? Anybody have the Office Store application set up and working?
We haven't tried it here at FDS yet, so
Okay.
I think ours is pretty similar to what everybody else does.
Does your instructor create the local copy on your PC?
No, it does not actually create the actual copy of the Open Store, the Office Store application. If you have a PC, though, that you can load applications on, if it wouldn't be a problem, you could download the what they call the test drive version of Studio off the 4J's website. I could send you the link for that. And it's probably about a 15-20 minute process to get it set up. You'd have to download it, which would take a few minutes, and then you'd have to set it up. Is that something that might be feasible?
Actually, I think using our current installation and just adapting the lab to the database we have would probably be more effective.
Yeah, so you have to do we'd be in the same boat as TFAs, and we have to do all our custom setup and everything. Configuration would have to change.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's probably time consuming. I think in the interest of time that
Just
they're okay with following along with their application.
Okay.
That probably wouldn't be as easy.
Okay, that sounds fine. Fine with me. I guess you can just experiment a bit with the commands and views that we talked about today, and then we'll figure out something for tomorrow that might be similar. How does that sound?
That sounds good.
Okay. All right. Okay, well, I know you're probably tired today. It's 1 o'clock Central Time, so that makes it, what, 2 o'clock Eastern Time. And getting close to lunch. I was about to say, getting close to lunchtime for the folks on the West Coast. So let's call it a day today, and then I'll see you same time tomorrow, and we'll start with Module 3 tomorrow, and I'll try to have some answers to your questions as well. Does that sound good?
Cool. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. See you tomorrow. Bye-bye.